Hi, in this video we're going to go through the Navigate sample data, which is part of the Develop in Swift tutorials. Here we've been working on using SwiftData, and in this one we're going to get started with how to use sample data to help with the previews within your app. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead and create a new project. So we'll open Xcode, create a new project, and we have an iOS app. We choose next, and we're going to call this Friends Favorite Movies. And go ahead and click. So sorry, before we create it, note that we're not using the SwiftData storage built in. We want to add this manually again. And so make sure you've got the similar settings, and we'll go ahead and choose next, and then save it and create. So for this project, what we want to do is use a tab view. And a tab view allows you to have separate categories or separate screens to where each tab has its own child views, so you can navigate and have different content. So the first thing we'll do is let's remove the VStack, and we'll start with tab view. And then in the closure, what we're doing is we're adding a tab, and we'll have one tab called Friends. And then we'll give it an image, system image, and it'll be person dot and dot person. And then for now, for the content within this tab, we're just going to have a text that says Friends. Then if we want another tab, we just add it here in the tab view. So we'll say tab, and we'll call this Movies. And again, we'll give this one a system image, and we'll use film.stack. And again, for the content, we'll just say text, and it'll say Movies. So now you can interact with this and see, note when we click the Movies tab, it changes the content there, and we switch back and forth. And notice, because we're using the latest Xcode 26, we get the iOS 26 liquid display behaviors, so you can have fun with that. Now we want to create some data models to represent the data that's used in our application. So let's come up here, right click on the folder, and choose New File from Template. And we want a Swift file, and then choose Next. And we're going to call this Friend, and go ahead and create. Similar to what we did in the last tutorial, where we want this to work with SwiftData, we need to first import SwiftData. And then we use the model macro, and then we use a class. You remember we need to use a class for this object, and we'll call it Friend. And this will have a name variable, and it'll be of type string. And remember, when you have a class, you need an initializer. So we'll go ahead and create that, and we'll say init. And then with the autocomplete, go ahead and choose tab, and it fills it in for us. So now we've temporarily, for now, we're going to use this as the data that we need on the class friend object. Note that we use the keyword self, and here you're assigning the property, the friend property name, to equal the parameter, what is passed in. And so that's why we use the keyword self.name. So notice they're both called name, but because we say self.name, that means we're attaching it to the property of the friend object for the instance that we create. Next, we want to create another data model. And so we'll right click, choose New File from Template, and it's a Swift file. Choose Next. And we're going to call this Movie, and then press return. And again, this will import SwiftData, and then we'll use the at model, and we'll say class, and we'll call it movie. The movie class is going to have a couple of properties. One is var title, which is a string, and then var release date, which is a date. Again, we need an initializer, and so we'll say init, and then press tab, and it'll autocomplete that for us. So now we satisfy that. Now that we have the data model to represent the information we're going to display, we need to update and add more screens to our application. So we're going to create a SwiftUI view, and we're going to right-click, choose New File from Template, and with iOS selector, we're actually going to go and select SwiftUI view, and then choose Next. And this is going to be our friend list. Go ahead and create that. And remember, when you're working with SwiftData, we need to import SwiftData into this view. Import. Boy, I got to spell better than that. SwiftData. And then you remember from previous tutorials, we have a query property, and that allows us to pull data from our model context. And so we're going to say query, and then we do open parentheses sort, so that when we get our data, it's going to sort it. And it's going to sort, we do the \friend.name. And then this will be a private var, and this will be a friends array. And so it'll be an array of friend objects. So again, the query pulls the data from the model context, the data that lives in the application. In order to see the data in our preview, we need to update, we need to pass in the model container. So we add the modifier on the friends list. We say dot model container, and we're going to say for, and it'll be of type friend.self, and then we're going to say in memory, and we set it to true. And remember, we use in memory because when you're working with a preview, you want the data to be updated instantly, and you don't want to be saving the data to disk or to your computer where it doesn't get refreshed and doesn't get deleted automatically. And so when you say in memory, then it'll stay until the preview refreshes, and that's just easier to work with. So that's why we say in memory true. We then need to add an environment variable. So we'll say at environment, and then we're passing in dot model context, and this will be a private var context. So you remember, it's the environment property that accesses the global information. So here we can access data that's associated with the application. Let's update our UI so that we use a list. So we're going to replace the text, and we're going to say list, and then we're going to say for. We're going to use the for each view, which iterates over an array, and in this case it's going to be friends array. And then in our closure, we're going to say friend in, and then when we, for each friend, we're going to create a text, and we're going to say the friend.name. Now, at the moment, we don't have any data in our model context, so we don't have anything to show. So let's fix that. From the previous tutorial, we use a task modifier to add some sample data. And so we put that at the end of the list, and we say dot task, and we press tab, and then in our code we're going to say context dot insert, and in this case we'll just insert a friend, and then they'll have a name, and we can pick any name you want. The tutorial says Elena, so we'll go with that. And then we'll say context dot insert, and we'll add another friend, and their name can be Rhodey. So remember, we're just temporarily inserting data into the context. And when you add data to the context, then the query automatically pulls and refreshes the array from the context for us. So we don't add data directly to the friends array. We actually add it to the context, which is the Swift data that persists in memory or on device, however it's being saved. And then the query will pull from that context and then populate the friends array, and then the list gets updated. You remember that the task is just, we're adding temporary data. And so this whole tutorial today is going to show how to use a better process for creating sample data so that your preview can be updated with the data that while you're designing the UI. And so for now, we're going to use the task, but later we'll update that. All right, let's go over to Content View, and in place of our friends, we'll remove the text and we'll call our friend list. We also need to add the model container to the preview. So we say dot model container for, and it'll be the friend.self, and we say in memory is true. Now, what's interesting is the tutorial doesn't show this, but we need to import SwiftData. So go ahead and import SwiftData, and that should take care of the error that shows up. And now we see our sample data. And if you remember, so let's go back. So if you take a look, here's movies, and you go back to the friends list, remember there's a problem. When you use task, it runs every time the view loads. Well, currently we're adding the same sample data both times, and so it duplicates the data. So we're going to fix that here next. What we want to do is create a model container and create a file that represents the sample data so that we can load the sample data into each view rather than using the task. So to get started, let's create a new Swift file. So right-click on the Friends Favorite Movies folder, choose New File from Template, and again we want a Swift file, and then choose Next, and we're going to call this Sample Data. Go ahead and create that. Here we want to import Swift data, and then we'll create a class called Sample Data. Now before, in our list and everything, we were creating a model container with the preview and then passing data into it. But now what we want is to create the model container in our sample data. So we're going to go through a number of things. You're going to see a number of errors as we type the code, but just bear with us as we go through this. It'll make sense after we get through everything. Let's start by creating a constant. We'll say let model container, and it'll be of type model container. We're going to create our own initializer method. So instead of doing the autocomplete, just go ahead and type init and then open and closing parentheses and then open and closing curly brace. Rather than passing in the data for the model container, we're actually going to create it inside our init function, and we want to do that so that outside of this class, nothing else has to worry about how this is created. So it's all done internally. So for now, we're going to get some error messages. We're going to go through a whole bunch of things, but we'll see through until we get to the end for this file, and we'll get it working. We want to create a schema, and so we'll say let schema equal, and we'll call schema, and then opening parenthesis, and then we do a square bracket, and inside that bracket we're going to pass in an array of the objects that we want this schema to reference. So we're going to say friend.self and movie.self. So here what we've done is we're passing in the data objects that we're going to save in our custom model container. After that, we want to create what is called a model configuration. So we'll say let model configuration equal model configuration, and then it asks for a schema, and we're going to pass in the schema that we just created, and then we're going to say is stored in memory only and set that to true. Because we're using this sample data just for the previews, we only want this to load in memory. We don't want to persist it on the device like we talked about before. Okay, next we want to create, we want to set our model container, or sorry, model. Yeah, we need to initialize our model container and say equal to model container, and then and we'll say schema, and then configurations. It takes an array of configurations, and in our case, we're just going to pass in the one model configuration. This next error says call can throw, but it is not marked with try, and the error is not handled. So when we're working with certain functions in Swift, you'll have where a method on an object will throw an error. And what that means is we need to be able to address any errors that happen, and we use what is called a try. And so we put a keyword in front of this, and we say try. Then what we need to do next is we need to actually address any errors that it throws. And the reason you do that is so that if you want the app to handle any errors, so let's say you go to access the data and it doesn't exist, you want it to, if there's something the user needs to do, for example, if you're downloading data from the internet and you've got an error when it doesn't load the data, then you want to handle that properly. In our case, we're just showing sample data. So to handle that, we want to wrap this method or this statement here in what is called a do and catch. So what we're saying is we use the keyword do and then an open curly brace, and then we come down here past the line, and then we do a closing curly brace, and then we say catch, and then another closure. So what this will do is it's wrapping everything, all the code that executes in this do block is potential that if something fails, it's going to throw an error. And so when we use the keyword try, that means this could potentially fail, at which point we catch and we handle the errors. Now, we still need to handle the error. So to do that, we're going to use a method called fatal error. And inside the fatal error, we're going to say could not create model container, and then we want to show the error. And so we use the string interpolation where we wrap with, we do the backspace, open parentheses, and then error, and then closing parentheses, and then finally we close that out. So now what happens is a fatal error will actually crash the app, and there's, in this instance, we're creating the container and there's no reason for it to fail. And so we use a fatal error when we want to call attention to any code that we did not expect to fail. And so it helps you keep track of things. So if you have something that shouldn't ever fail, then when you have a fatal error, that means you didn't code it correctly. So in our case, we're just wrapping this in a fatal error, which will cause the app to crash. But for our purposes, we're always creating the model container and it shouldn't be an issue. Next, we want to create another property, and it's going to be a static let, and it's called shared, and it's going to create an instance of sample data. Now, what we're doing is we're using a method that allows you to create only one instance of this object. And the reason for that is we don't want to have multiple instances of sample data being created. So we use this static shared so that it only gets created once. And if it exists, then it references the one that's already been created. So that's why we handle it in this way. The next thing we want to do is we want to set the private keyword in front of the init so that the init can't be accessed outside of the sample data. We also need another property, and this will be a computed property. So we'll say var context, and this will be a model context. And inside, we're going to return the model container dot main context. So this could be accessed outside of the sample data class, but the sample data gets created internally, and so it'll only happen when we call the shared, and we'll show how that works here in a second. But for now, just understand that we're setting this up so that everything's created internally, and we only have one instance of the sample data whenever we run the application. The tutorial shows, it talks about an error, and in our case, the error is not happening. But we'll go ahead and do what the tutorial says, which is we want to set a property on here that says main actor. And it has to do with the way that Swift handles concurrency. And when the code runs, we want this code to run on what is called the main actor, which is where all of the Swift UI code gets generated, so that when you're accessing this data, if you have something running in the background, the UI that gets created will always have access to this. So we set this as main actor. And the tutorial refers to, there's a potential for an error where when you access main context, it's going to say main context has to be accessed on a main actor. And so we're setting this property explicitly so that when you're running it, it'll always be available in the Swift UI when it gets created. All right, now we have this set up. We want to create some sample data that can then be accessed. So if we go over to our friend object, and here let's create a static property that has some data for us, and we'll say static let sample data, which equals an array of friends. So we're going to give ourselves a few friends, and you can use whatever names you want. I'm just going to go with what the tutorial says. So we're going to say friend name, and we're going to say Graham, and friend name, we're going to say Mayuri, and let's do one more. Well, it says please have at least 5 friends. So now I got to go find more friends. Okay, Rich, and then we'll have a friend named Rhodey. All right, we've got our friends. So now we have some static data, which means it'll always be available. We don't have to create an instance of friend. It'll just be available if we reference the sample data. Let's go back to the sample data class, and we need to create a function that inserts the sample data. So we're going to say private function insert sample data. And here we're going to do what's called a for in loop. So we're going to say for friend in friend.sample data. And then we're going to we're going to insert that friend into the context. So let's talk about this. So a for in loop is a way to iterate over an array of data. And the first property here is just a reference to whatever the object is that's in this sample data. In this case, it's sample data. And so here we're saying for friend in friend.sample data, for each one of these friends, we're going to insert them into the context. Because remember, we add data to the context to make it available in the UI. So now what we've done is for each friend in the sample data, we've added them to our context. We need to call this method in our do block. We want to call the method so that it does create the sample data. And in this case, normally when you have methods that could potentially throw an error, you would put them in a do catch block like this. But in our case, we don't have any concerns about it throwing an error, and that's okay. But we need to make sure that the insert sample data happens after the model container is created. So now when this gets initialized, it creates all these things and then inserts the data, and now we can access that later. One other thing we need to do is we need to say try context.save. And this allows us to then save the model context, save the data that we've added to it. Now we have everything we need in order to load the sample data into our friend list. So let's go over to the friend list. And here, we don't want to use the task anymore. So let's go ahead and delete that. And now what we can do is, instead of having an empty model container, we can go ahead and reference the sample data that we've already created. So to do that, we say sample data dot shared dot model container. And notice it immediately updates, and now it shows our list of friends. If we go over to the content view, we need to update this model container so that we can see the data here. So again, we say sample data dot shared dot model container, and now it shows up in the content view. Now that we have the data for the friends, let's go ahead and do the same thing for the movies. So let's go over to our movie class, and here we need to create and enter some sample data. So we're going to say static let sample data equals, and we'll pass in. So remember, square brackets are the array literal, and here we could then pass in a movie, and a movie has a title, and the title, we're just making these up, so we're just like Amusing Space Traveler 3. And then the release date, we're going to say date. And in our case, we're going to use another method on the date class. We're going to say time interval since reference date. And what that is it's a reference date, specifically January 1st, 2001. And again, it's just a specific date and time that allows you to reference so that everything can be calculated based on a specific time. And in our case, we can pass in a negative, so we can say 402 underscore 000 underscore 000. And so what this is doing is we're passing negative 402 million milliseconds. And so this will be in a date prior to the reference date. Now we want to have more than one movie, and in our case, I'm just going to copy and paste from the tutorial. So I'm off screen here, but you can do the same, or you can create your own. I'm just going to paste in, let's see, let's put a comma after that, and then paste in. And if we select this and you press Control I, it'll indent everything properly. So now we've got a handful of fake movies. Now that we have sample data for our movies, let's go over to the sample data class and update our insert sample data so that we add the movies to our model context. So we say, actually we just have to, we We do another for. We're going to say movie in, and we're going to say movie dot sample data. We're going to say context dot insert movie. So again, it's going to, for every item in the sample data array on the movie class, we're going to insert that movie into our context. We need to now create the movie list UI. So let's create a new file. Come over to Friends, Favorite Movies. Right click, choose New File from Template. And we want the Swift UI view. And choose Next. And we'll call this Movie List. Then on our movie list, we want to pass in the .model container. And we're going to say sample data .shared .model container. And remember, we need to import SwiftUI so that we can access that data. We'll say SwiftData. And then from here, we need to add a couple of variables. You remember we have a query parameter. So we're going to say query. I'm pressing tab for the autocomplete, just a reminder. I kind of moved quickly, but as you get used to it, you'll start to use the tab key quite a bit. So open parentheses, and we're going to sort, and we're going to do /movie.title. So now every movie we get, we're going to sort it by, all the movies will be sorted by their title. And again, this is a private var movies, which is an array, an array of movie objects. Remember, we need an environment variable, and we're going to pass in, we want the .model context, and this will be private var context. In the body, we want to change this to a list, so we'll say list, and we'll say for each, and we'll pass in the movies. And for each of our movies, we're going to say movie in, and then we say text, and we'll say movie.title. And now we have a list of movies. You can see that there. At the moment, we're referencing the context, but we haven't actually used it. In the next tutorials, we're actually going to be able to add, update, and delete movies as well as friends. So for now, we're setting the foundation for that. So at the moment, we've created a variable called context, but we actually haven't done anything with it at the moment. Let's jump over to the content view, and now in the movies tab, let's go ahead and replace this with movie list. And now when we click the movies tab, it switches. Check that out. Now that we have our list of friends and our list of movies, we want to be able to next navigate within each tab, and we want to update the UI to show a little more information. So to do that, we're going to use what is called the navigation split view. Let's go to the friend list, and from here we're going to embed the list in. So right click on the word list and then choose embed, and we're going to say navigation split, whoops, I gotta spell it right, split view, press tab, and then it's going to throw an error because it expects a detail. So we're going to say detail and then opening curly brace. So the way this works, when you're working with a split view on the iPhone, you're only going to see the list, and then when we add some more code here, it'll allow us to navigate to the next detail screen. But if we're using an iPad, then we can actually see both the list on the left and the detail on the right. We'll see that here in a minute, but this is why we're using the navigation split view, because we can then get some UI behaviors that we want. Let's add a navigation title, and we put that on the list itself. So at the end of the list, we want to say .navigation title, and we're going to call that friends. And notice how it shows up in our UI. And then what we need to do is, for every item in our list, we need to create what's called a navigation link. And to do that, we click on the text and we right click and we say embed, and we're going to say navigation link. And then in the parentheses, we're going to say friend.name. And then here in the text, we're going to say detail view for, and then we're going to pass in the friend.name. So just bear with me as we clean this up. So we're doing the quotes like that. So what we're doing is we now have a navigation link, and then in the detail, when we click on the link, it's going to go to this, it's going to show the keyword, it's going to show this text. So if I click on this, notice that it says detail view for Elena, which is the first friend, and then we click the back button. So when we say navigation link, we now are passing in the text, which is the text you see here. And then when you click on that, you're going to see the text here, which is this text detail. So that's how that works. Let's update our text inside the navigation link so that we get a navigation title, and we'll pass in friend, and then we'll say navigation bar title display mode, and we're going to say .inline. So now when I click on a friend, notice it says friend up here, and the display mode is now set to inline. And so it, again, the behavior looks a little differently when you're on an iPad versus a phone. So to see this on the iPad, down here under the preview where it says automatic, we can select that, and then we can select iPad. So go ahead and choose iPad. Now this is going to spin up a simulator, and it takes a few seconds or a couple of minutes, but notice up here at the top, it's preparing the iPad simulator. And so again, it's loading, and it can take a few minutes the first time this runs. So just be aware of that. It doesn't look like anything's happening, but at the top, it's actually getting it set up. So now we see the iPad, and here you see the navigation split view. And so when we click on a person, we see the title and the detail and the information there. And when you click on different ones, and you can hide it or show it. And so that's the behavior you get with the iPad. Let's go ahead and switch it back to the phone. Let's clean up the detail view so that there's something shown. In fact, I realized, let's go back to the iPad, sorry. Let's go back to the iPad. Notice this detail down here, we don't have anything in it. And on the iPhone, it's because we don't ever see that. But on the iPad, we do see this detail. So this block right here refers to what is shown when there is nothing selected. So what we want to do is we want to have a text, and we want to say select a friend, and then we'll give it a navigation title of friend, and then navigation bar title display mode .inline. And so see how it changes the display. And so here we have it's inline versus on top like it was. So now you see this on the iPad, but again, this isn't used on the iPhone at the moment. Well, it's not used on the iPhone, so just keep that in mind. Let's jump over to the movie list, and we're going to do the same thing. So the first thing we'll do is embed the list. So we right click, choose embed, and we're going to say navigation split view. And then again, we need to add a detail. So we say detail, and within the text, we need to update that, embed it in a navigation link. And the text will be movie.title. And then inside the text for the detail, it's going to say detail view for, and let's clean this up so that it is quotes. We have the right. So it says detail view for movie title. And again, we want to set some modifiers. We're going to say navigation title, and it's going to say movie, and then navigation bar title display mode dot inline. And to see that, we click here, and now you see the detail view for electrifying time. So whatever that is, tree, what is that? I can't read it, it's too small. But you get the idea. Oh, electrifying trek is what that says. Boy, it's like a eye test. I can't even read it. Okay. Then we need to update the detail for when there's nothing selected. Remember, we're going to say text select a movie, and then set that to navigation title as movie. And notice how it's currently set large like that. And so we changed the dot navigation bar title display to dot inline so that it looks more like that. So now it says select a movie. All right, let's go to the content view and see what we've got. And again, we have the iPad selected. And notice on the iPad, the tabs are up here at the top. And so we can select movies. We can pick a movie and see that. And we can select friends. We can select a friend and see it there. If you switch this to the phone, then we can see the behavior on the phone. And again, we've got movies and friends. Awesome, good job. Let's go ahead and see how we did. Let's go to the end of this tutorial and, whoops, too far. Let's check our understanding. Which code below displays list row in a root view and presents detail view as its detail? So, if we take a look at this, we have, the first thing is it's a navigation link. So we know it's one of these two. And then next, it says displays list row in a root view and presents detail view as its detail. So notice the detail view is what's inside the block, and the root view, or if this is a list, then that's the title that shows up. So it's going to be this one. Choose submit. It says, yep, the argument in the navigation link initializer contains the text for the row, and the view in the closure is its destination. All right, next question. Which option below correctly uses code that may throw an error? So the way it works is, remember, it was a do catch block. So that means it's one of these two. And then notice we use the keyword try because it's possible that this can throw an error. So we have to use that. So no, let's select that one. Awesome. Use do catch to call throwing code and handle any errors that were thrown. The try keyword marks the call to the throwing code. Sweet. Okay, how can you ensure that model data only stays in memory so that it's easy to use in previews? Well, we want to, look at this. It gives us, this is a trick question. Look at that, model container or model context, because it says pass true to the in-memory parameter. I'm going to say model data only stays in memory. Well, this is tricky. I think I'm going to go, because on model context, I think it's model container. Let's try it. Yep. By keeping the data only in memory, you ensure that it's never persisted to disk. Awesome. Great job. So this sample project we're going to keep and we're going to use in the next couple of videos. So thank you again for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.